Souls Unitarian Universalist Church, building community, inspiring growth, creating change. Here in the heart of Kansas City, we come together to create this hour of shared reflection so that we might be renewed in courage for these times and inspired to lives of greater dignity, higher purpose, deeper generosity, and more effective action. If you are new to Unitarian Universalism or to our congregation, we want to get to know you and share part of your journey. If this place is already your spiritual home, welcome once more. We need one another, and it is good to be together again. Because we care for one another's safety, our congregation is gathering online during this long season of coronavirus pandemic. Nevertheless, through the gifts of technology, we continue to celebrate community and connections as we lean into the values of justice, compassion, and reason. Together, we learn the love that has the power to overcome both loneliness in the heart and oppression in the world. Welcome to our service this morning. May the words and music and images that we offer today nourish our best selves, calling forth abundant wisdom and love. Arise, O souls, arise. Good morning, and welcome to All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church of Kansas City online worship gathering for June 13th, 2021. A little more than 60 years ago, on May 15th, 1961, the Universalist and Unitarian denominations formally consolidated their organizations to form the Unitarian Universalist Association. Although both of these movements have long historical roots, the UUA as we know it today is only a little more than half a century old. This new organization came of age during the civil rights struggle of the early 60s, with moments of great heroism and sacrifice and moments of damaging institutional conflict over how best to support the work of equality and justice. Although some UUs, especially those from marginalized communities, had an intuitive awareness of how difficult it would be for an institution founded and steeped in the culture of privilege to become fully invested in change, the vocabularies of implicit bias, institutional racism, white privilege, and colonialist dominance had not then been widely articulated, and the discomfort of confronting internalized racism became intolerable for many UU congregations and organizations. The developing denomination turned its attention to the struggles of women and of LGBTQ communities to claim institutional space and power, not entirely without resistance, but with better outcomes among UU communities. As a new generation has come to re-examine the narratives around earlier attempts to challenge racial privilege within the UUA, the inevitable discomfort of such work in the face of inescapable white privilege began to be named and acknowledged. The Black Lives Matter movement reinforced the demand that traditional UU cultural elites should attend to and amplify marginalized voices, rather than continuing to center the perspectives of existing power structures. This year, on the 60th anniversary of our founding as an association, we contemplate a proposal to add an 8th principle to our statement of UU Covenant, a principle that would commit us to the dismantling of racism and other forms of oppression in the service of spiritual wholeness and beloved community. The mid-20th century Unitarian theologian James Luther Adams used to say that the church was a laboratory in which we tested the implications of attempting actually to live as an institution and community by the values we claim to believe in. It is messy and complex work to embody our convictions in our relationships and to behave our ideals into the real world, especially as a group. It requires lifelong practice in patience and grace, in forgiving each other and ourselves, in remembering to breathe, to listen, to learn and to grow, and to let go. Week by week, we gather to be reminded, to encourage each other, to renew our commitment to building the world we have envisioned together. We kindle this flaming chalice, symbol of our heritage of a free faith. In celebration of 60 years of building religious community in which all souls are welcome and truth is a forever unfinished revelation. May its light continue to lead us onward into a future of possibilities greater than we have yet imagined, beckoned by hope, nurtured in joy, accountable to love. I invite you now to share in the chat where your chalice is lighted this morning, after which we will speak the words of our congregational covenant, and then sing once more the hymn that was written for and first sung at the ceremony of merger on that May evening 60 years ago. Now let's join together in speaking once again our covenant promises to this community. Together we affirm, goodwill is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. In 1960, the leaders of the Universalist Church in America and of the American Unitarian Association prepared to bring their two separate denominations into consolidation to form the current Unitarian Universalist Association. One requirement of this process was to formulate a new set of bylaws for the new association to operate as a formal organization under the laws of the state of Massachusetts. Both original organizations had amended their separate bylaws many times over the previous century and a half as their theological perspectives had evolved. It was a demanding process to come up with a statement that both groups could agree to adopt for the proposed merger. Humanist language of that day put a great emphasis on the nature of man and the duties and capacities of mankind. Within 20 years of that consolidation process in 1961, the feminist movement in both politics and spirituality had grown dissatisfied with the very gendered language of that first statement of purpose in the new UUA's bylaws. Over the course of 3 years in the early 80s, a denominational task force undertook studies and conversations to build an understanding of the ideas that actually brought our members into community and covenant. In July of 1985, the General Assembly of the UUA voted approval of the proposed 7 principles and 5 sources of Unitarian Universalism. 10 years later, in 1995, following the publication of the new hymnal, Singing the Living Tradition, which included significant material expressing a theology of locating the divine in the world of nature, a 6th source was added to the original 5, acknowledging the importance of earth-based spiritual traditions such as paganism. That statement of 7 principles and 6 sources has served well as a summary of our faith community's self-understanding for the past 25 years, which is a rather long time for UUs to agree about anything. These are the principles that we have committed to affirm and promote. The inherent worth and dignity of every person. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. A free and responsible search for truth and meaning. The right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. Note that these are not beliefs we are instructed to hold, but rather ways of relating to each other and the world that we commit to practice. This year, for the first time since the addition of the 6th source in 95, another change is being proposed to this core statement, the addition of an 8th principle. It says that we also affirm and promote journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our associations. This proposal arises out of the work of many congregations and groups within the UUA on issues of cultural racism and privilege, both in American society and within our own churches and institutions. Here to tell us a bit more about the origins and significance of the eighth principle is Paula Cole-Jones, one of its authors.
Language opens up the possibility of change for us. We cannot change what we cannot see or imagine. We cannot bring into existence what we cannot share collectively. Building the beloved community is a journey of collectively learning to see and overcome the limitations and barriers of historical inequalities and exclusion. The words of the eighth principle were carefully chosen to help us understand how to get there, how to create an environment for the beloved community to thrive, and how to make it core to Unitarian Universalism. The eighth principle strengthens the relevance of Unitarian Universalism in our society and in the larger world. It will transform how we understand and actualize the promise of the existing principles. For many of us, our principles serve as a covenant or our promises to one another. Now, covenants are powerful, or they can be. They hold the potential to transform relationships, communities, institutions, and culture. So why would we propose an eighth principle? The current Unitarian Universalist principles were adopted by our General Assembly in 1985. Between 1961, the time of the merger of Unitarian Unitarianism and Universalism. I'm so used to saying the two words together. But in 1961, at the time of our merger, and until 1985, with the adoption of our current principles, revisions were made so that our principles would be gender neutral. They were made to remove the male dominant language. And this was done for greater equality and inclusion of women. We, as an association, adapted to the changing times. Now that was 35 years ago that we adopted our principles in 1985. We've continued to evolve in our understanding of inclusion. In 1997, which was 12 years after the principles were adopted, Unitarian Universalists voted to become an anti-racism institution. We have not gone back to reflect what we have learned in our principles. Now, I believe if we were writing the principles today, that no doubt we would have been explicit about the beloved community. So the eighth principle, you can look at it really as an update. We are saying that we promise to work at being a religious community that is free of racism and oppression. A religious community that is on the spiritual journey of building the beloved community. Now, after 35 years, I think we can ask ourselves, well, why did it take us so long? I don't have a specific answer for that, but I do want to say that the eighth principle is our proposal to be in covenant with the beloved community. It provides Unitarian Universalists with an unmistakable value of the human family whole and reconciled. The multicultural, beloved community would no longer be implied as it currently is. It would be explicitly stated as part of our spiritual journey. And with these 8 principles, we are saying to each other and to the world, this is who we are. These are our core values. So please join us in building a society and church communities that are free of racism and oppression. This is our unfinished business as society and as religious institutions. Collectively, we can do this, and we owe it to those who have gone before us and done this work, to those that are working at it now. We owe it to our children, and we owe it to those who are yet to come. And in closing, I want to repeat some of the words from Reverend Manisha's reading as I started. And I quote, "The natural course of life is always pushing us toward greater understandings of what it means to be human." End quote. Ashe, and may it be so. Thank you.
As many of you know, June is LGBTQ Pride Month in Kansas City and across the nation. This month, in particular, it's important to recognize the spiritual turmoil that many LGBTQ people experience. I'm fortunate in that my parents and spiritual advisors have always loved me and accepted me for who I am. But many LGBTQ people are not so lucky. One person I met, whom we will call Sam, was an example of this. When Sam came out to his conservative Catholic family, his mother took all 7 Bibles they had in the house and threw them at him. His church was of no help to him during his suffering. Another person I met, whom we will call Greg, was an example of this. Greg was very passionate and involved in his Christian church. He even got his partner to start attending services in various church activities. However, when the church's minister found out that Greg and his male partner were together, Greg was given 2 options: break up with his loved one and become celibate, or leave the church. As depressed as he was about it, Greg had no choice but to leave his religious foundation. For people like Sam and Greg, All Souls and the other UU churches are a refuge. Without churches like All Souls, these LGBTQ people have no spiritual base and are out wandering life with no spiritual guidance. That's why it's so important to support All Souls through our online collection in these virtual times. Please give to the All Souls collection today, so people like Sam, Greg, and myself have a church that we can call home.
We're gonna sit at the welcome table. We're gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days, hallelujah. We're gonna sit at the welcome table. Gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days. All kinds of people around that table. All kinds of people around that table one of these days, hallelujah. All kinds of people around that table. Gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days. No fancy style at the welcome table. Gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days. Gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days. One of these days.
Let's say together the words of dedication for our offering. We dedicate our offerings and our actions to the mission at the heart of this congregation, to build a respectful, caring community, to inspire personal and spiritual growth, and to create change toward a just and compassionate society.
From Building the Beloved Community by Reverend Carl Gregg. In progressive religious circles, you will often hear calls to build the beloved community, but I'm not sure we always appreciate the full historic resonance of that phrase. The term beloved community was coined by the early 20th century American philosopher Josiah Royce. But most of us learned about it not from Royce, but from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who often spoke of the beloved community as his ultimate goal. As an early example, after the Montgomery bus boycotts, in speaking about the larger movement toward which they were building, Dr. King said, "The end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opponents into friends. It is this type of understanding goodwill that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of men." As Dr. King said in his 1967 A Christmas Sermon on Peace, "We will not only win freedom for ourselves, we will so appeal to your heart and conscience that we will win you in the process, and our victory will be a double victory." That's what he meant by a love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of men, practices like nonviolent activism that break open the hearts of your opponents, confronting them with the inherent worth and dignity of peoples and groups that they falsely believe to be less than fully human.
To look even farther back, the vision of the beloved community is in many ways a secularized version of what Jesus called the kingdom of God. But too often, Jesus is confused with the White Queen from Alice in Wonderland. Christianity, however, is not about believing 6 impossible things before breakfast. Rather, following the way of Jesus is about practicing radical kindness and compassion in our day, just as Jesus did in his time and place, a love that dares to transgress cultural and tribal divisions. For Dr. King, the beloved community was a realistic, achievable goal that could be attained by a critical mass of people committed to and trained in the philosophy and methods of nonviolence. How might such a paradigm shift help us move away from what Dr. King called the 3 greatest threats to building the beloved community: racism, materialism, and militarism? In our own lives, what would it look like to seek to communicate with one another, even when we're stressed out, with less harshness and more nonviolent compassion?
Much of what I know about how to read the Bible, I learned from feminists. When I was in seminary, we became acquainted with many large words, some of which are actually quite useful. One of those words was hermeneutic. It means basically the perspective that you take when reading a text. As a very simple example, if you are reading a recipe from the point of view of a vegan, you would probably be looking to see whether it included meat or animal products. If you were reading it from the perspective of a mom about to prepare dinner, you might be asking if your kids would be likely to enjoy the dish. If you were an editor about to publish a cookbook, you would be exploring whether this recipe would be a good fit for that book. The idea is that everyone brings an agenda to their encounter with a text, and what you find in the text is influenced by what you are looking for, the way in which you read it. This is, of course, nowhere more true than in reading the Bible or other scriptures. What we gather from it will depend on the attitude and the questions we bring to it. Those attitudes and questions are your hermeneutic. That is why it's a seminary word. Back in the 70s, the feminist movement was urging religious scholars to approach the Bible with what they called a hermeneutic of suspicion. What was being left out or left unsaid about the stories of women? Why did women characters so often not have names? How did God's rules and actions affect women differently from men, and why? Was the historical patriarchy of the Christian church inherent in the scripture or not? Was the Bible perhaps more radical and egalitarian than the church had let on? Rather than just accepting that what was in the Bible was the Word of God and had to be ethically correct, a hermeneutic of suspicion invited readers to question the text, to ask whose interests were being served in a given rule, whose agenda was being reflected in a particular narrative, what kind of spin a certain editor might have applied. For a lot of people, this was a revelatory process. For me, having grown up as a UU, it seemed sort of obvious, but then it changed my view of the Ten Commandments. My early religious education considered the Bible as a humanly created text, but it had a generically positive attitude toward the classic statement of God's expectations in the Hebrew Scriptures. There might be an overemphasis on stuff like keeping the Sabbath and the sanctity of God's name, but, not committing murder or theft and not bearing false witness, those were useful foundational ideas for a fair, rational society. And I was good with it until my own hermeneutic of suspicion kicked in and asked, what is missing? And I realized that these basic prescriptions for a decent, holy society say nothing about rape. If I were making a list of the top 10 things that cannot be allowed in order for us to have a social order that is just and safe for me, the prohibition of rape would certainly take priority over, for instance, being respectful to your parents. That's good, of course. It's just that there is something far more fundamental about sexual consent. Now, I realize that you can make a strained argument that all sexual activity outside of marriage is a form of adultery and therefore by implication forbidden, and sex within marriage perhaps cannot be by definition constitute rape, but I don't buy it. Rather, I am persuaded that the various authors of this part of the scriptural tradition did not, in fact, regard rape as an important violation of their male God's expectations of obedience from his male followers. And indeed, there are multiple instances of other stories in the early scripture texts that would appear to validate this assumption. Once you recognize this kind of omission and its implications, it changes the way you see the whole tradition. Another lesson that we learned in seminary is that many different kinds of things can be read as texts. The rules of an organization and how things are run can be examined as if they constituted a text. Cultural traditions and expectations can be a text. It doesn't necessarily have to be written down. Architecture might be a text. A painting or a statue can be a text that is encountered with a certain hermeneutic. A person who uses a wheelchair, for instance, might read the text of a public building with a hermeneutic of suspicion. Has this edifice been designed to be accessible to someone like me? Does it recognize that I exist? Does it want me here? This, of course, is not the only way to read a building. It might be read as a commentary on the university Gothic style in the Beaux-Arts era, or as a celebration of sturdy Midwest independence from East Coast elitism. It might be read as a political boondoggle whose construction cost the state needless money for the benefit of the then governor's cronies, or as an attempt to intimidate would-be criminals with the majestic power of the law. It might be read as a celebration of elevators and central heating without regard to the costs of energy. There are many ways to read a given text, many hermeneutics. I share this background because I think it helps to explain why critical race theory, as it is currently being named, feels familiar to me, and why I find it not unduly threatening. With particular urgency since the deaths of Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and George Floyd, we are being invited to read the experience of American culture, its history, its legal, financial, and educational structures, its episodes of violence, and its policing practices as a text, through a hermeneutic of suspicion about its implications for people of color. No one can force us to do this. No one could force Christians to read the Bible through a hermeneutic of suspicion either, and some of them never would. They refused any lens but that of faith. The text was transparent and true, meant what it said, in whatever translation the reader happened to favor, and required no critical understanding. A parallel resistance to the reading of American history and culture through a hermeneutic of suspicion is easy to identify, both in public discourse and, if we are honest, in our own white reactivity. The Bible was easy for me, both because I grew up not identifying it as a formative text for my own identity, and because the hermeneutic of feminist suspicion came easily to me as a woman. The racial critique that we are now being asked to engage is more challenging. Personally, I've been dubious about American exceptionalism ever since I encountered the notion of manifest destiny in about 4th grade. It made no sense to me then, and it still doesn't. Perhaps because I have never believed that God hands out real estate, I find the notion that one group of people is special and thus entitled to take away lands from other people unfathomable. I did grow up with the noble pilgrims in search of religious liberty trope, and partly because their congregationalism is an ancestor to the free church in which I was nurtured and to which I have given my professional life, it has taken a while for me to grasp the inherent exploitation of the colonialist European mindset. However, I did get there eventually. But summon this daughter of the Enlightenment to read that history as text and examine it with a hermeneutic of suspicion, well, now we have us an intellectual ballgame. Most especially if the text we are going to use as a case in point is the way in which we Unitarian and Universalist heirs of the intellectual and financial elites of white New England, as well as the Enlightenment, have historically organized our church communities. What is most precious to us and closest to the source of our own identity is always the most difficult thing to investigate from a place of skepticism. It is hard work and so uncomfortable. It doesn't unfold in an orderly sequence. It's a mess. In fact, I think it is important to acknowledge that our resistance, my resistance, doesn't arise from our being evil, mean-spirited people. It arises from the entirely natural and necessary impulse to protect the integrity of what we believe in. The process of transformation and growth is pointless if we don't really care about our ideals and relationships anyway. But assuming that we do care about living in ways that manifest beauty, justice, and human dignity, then we have to be invested in what we know about how that happens, at the same time that we are always open to a better, more comprehensive understanding than we previously had. Whenever we settle in and get too comfortable, there is probably something that we are not paying attention to. For the past 25 years, our Unitarian Universalist community has gotten very comfortable with our statement of the 7 principles. It has been nice, that relative consensus about how to describe ourselves, both to ourselves and to those outsiders who ask in some bewilderment what in the Sam Hill we actually believe. The 7 principles offered something handy to teach our children in those developmental moments when they needed answers rather than questions. At the same time, all throughout those 25 years, people of color have been telling our communities in a variety of ways that they couldn't find the way in. That even when they discovered a UU church and agreed with it, their presence seemed unexpected, and they felt other in its midst. Potential members, potential ministers, potential leaders all read the community life of Unitarian Universalism, its implicit expectations and structures, its individualism and elitist privilege, with a hermeneutic of suspicion, and did not find themselves included. Over and over, those of us who found a birthright here were shocked, bewildered, even hurt by what we experienced as an accusation of unwelcome. We love diversity, we protested. We would love to have more of it. Y'all come on down. Just don't ask us to change. Don't ask us to read the text of our history and polity and culture through the hermeneutic of suspicion that people of color must, for their own safety, bring to every encounter with dominant American society. Because, that makes us really uncomfortable, and we don't come to church for that. And you know what? We don't come to church for that. No one does. No one gets up on Sunday morning and says, oh boy, let's go to church and feel bad about ourselves. I think there may be a mindset that says, let's go to church and watch other people feel bad about themselves. Or even more likely, let's go to church and feel superior to all those folks who ought to feel bad about themselves. As you may have noticed, I do my best not to cater to those expectations. We come to church looking for hope and encouragement and connection, to be reminded of beauty and generosity and grace, to be lifted up, not cast down. And here's the thing. I think that a hermeneutic of suspicion is one of the keys to that very inspiration we are seeking, because it keeps open the expectation that things could always be better than they are. It makes us ask, especially when we are most satisfied and comfortable, who is being left out? Who is not safe? It challenges us to be aware of the interdependent web in the places that we have ignored, that we have been taught by our privilege not to see. The hermeneutic of suspicion is what liberates us all from the bondage of what has been and from repeating the history whose lessons we have yet to learn. It can feel like loss, giving up those cherished, taken for granteds that we thought we knew. But the willingness to interrogate those assumptions is precisely what frees us for greater authenticity and new possibilities. The Bible actually became far more interesting and meaningful to me once I learned to ask questions about it. In his book, Love and Rage, Black Buddhist author Lama Rod Owens writes this: "When white folks hear me or others speak of white supremacy, there is a tendency to hear this critique as a personal attack, rather than an invitation to understand how whiteness in America is and remains an expression of dominance if there is not an effort to interrogate this expression. To be white is to be racist. That's how America was established. I am deeply hurt by this system, and that hurt means that I experience being pissed at the system of white supremacy, as well as how white folks continue to buy into that system." Now, the challenge for me is to be able to hear that this writer is angry at a system and at the way that I and others buy into this system without, as he says, making an effort to interrogate it, but not react to that anger as a personal attack. To begin to view the cultural texts of white supremacy through a hermeneutic of suspicion is an invitation to awareness that has the power to transform our own individual consciousness, yes, but more importantly, the power to shift the way we structure and understand the community in which we all must live together. In the 60th year of our age as an institution, we Unitarian Universalists have proposed to ourselves a new commitment. I do not say a new principle because the notion itself has been around for a long time. We are asking one another whether we are about creating something more than individual integrity, whether we might actually agree that spiritual wholeness can only thrive where the goal is beloved community, and whether we get that we can only do that by interrogating with suspicion the culture of supremacy that has been for so long the water we swim in. Just as the failure of the Ten Commandments to forbid rape implies a flaw in the whole tradition they represent that I, as a woman, can no longer dismiss, the resistance of UU institutions to renouncing the legacy benefits of white supremacy is an omission that communities of color can only ignore at the peril of ongoing harm. Is our faith community now willing to say to ourselves and others that our purpose for existing will never be fulfilled as long as oppression and privilege endure, implicit and unexamined, in our churches, in our association, and in our personal awareness? Martin Luther King Jr. once described beloved community as a realistic, achievable goal that could be attained by a critical mass of people committed to and trained in the philosophy and methods of nonviolence. It seems to me that the ability to apply a hermeneutic of suspicion is essential to the philosophy of nonviolence, so that we are always ready to examine the stories we think we are telling from another perspective, lest they do damage that we never intended. This is likely to take us to places we never expected and to make us deeply uncomfortable for a time, probably more than once. Yet it is the path to authentic freedom, to right relationship, to the wholeness that we long for more than we know. In the West African language of Ga, the expression weaya means something like, we keep on, we keep going. We may not always be sure exactly where the journey will take us next, and we may be pretty sure that there will be difficulties along the way. But something is calling to us, some aspiration and promise that summons us to persist together, because that is in fact the only way we will get anywhere, and to sing as we go.
We are going, heaven knows where we are going. We'll know we're there. We will get there. Heaven knows how we will get there. We know we will. It will be hard, we know. And the road will be muddy and rough, but we'll get there. Heaven knows how we will get there. We know we will. Oh yeah, yeah. 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 We are going, heaven knows where we are going. We'll know we're there. We will get there. Heaven knows how we will get there. We know we will. It will be hard, we know. And the road will be muddy and rough, but we'll get there. Heaven knows how we will get there. We know we will. Oh yeah, yeah. 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 Oh yeah, yeah.
There is no wholeness for one at the expense of harm to another. Therefore, let us strive to be ever pilgrim people by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions, journeying together toward spiritual wholeness and working in covenant to build a diverse, multicultural, loving, and beloved community. So be it.
Authentic Church, the future waits your liberating ministry. Go forward in the power of love, proclaim the
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fires of commitment. For all these we carry in our minds and hearts until the time shall come when we will be together again. Thank you for being here this morning to celebrate the 60th year of our UU Association. We invite everyone to gather now for a few moments of fellowship and informal conversation at our Community Connection Zoom room. You can find the link at our website homepage or right here in the chat. Don't forget to order your Sunday Plus meal for next week, and be sure to mark your calendars to join our National General Assembly Sunday service in 2 weeks on June 27th, which will start at 11 o'clock, not 11:15. Remember that. That afternoon on the 27th, we will gather on our beautiful church grounds for an in-person ice cream social. Bring your masks and let's greet one another in person. Also check the website for information about memorial events for Linda Parkinson, Dick Dawson, and Bill Owens. We hope you will be with us again next week when our good friend Reverend Duncan Teague will lead us in our observance of Juneteenth. Until then, please, everyone, get your vaccine if you have not already. Take care, stay safe, and be well this week.